You thought you knew this woman. You were wrong. For half a century she looked at you from the screen, smiling, making you laugh, holding an entire country by the hand. Millions adored her. They called her a queen. They gave her every award imaginable, wrote tributes, held her up as an example. And all that time, behind that smile, something was hidden that she never told anyone. Not one journalist, not one biographer. 50 years of silence. 50 years of a secret she would have taken with her, if she hadn't decided to speak. Right now, at 92. Carol Burnett, and for the first time, the whole truth. Who was the mysterious stranger who gave her money and changed everything? Why did she refuse to say his name for 50 years? And what exactly did she promise him with trembling hands? What was really happening behind the closed doors of her home while the country laughed along with her every Saturday night? Why did she end up in a courtroom at 90 years old? Not as a star, but as a person who had no other choice left. And what did that bouquet of flowers from a stranger in a restaurant actually mean? Flowers he could not possibly have known anything about. This is not a biographical summary. This is not a ceremonial portrait of an icon. This is the story that Hollywood preferred not to look at too closely, because it is too real, too raw, and too uncomfortable for a beautiful legend. Stay until the end, because the most unexpected part is not at the beginning and not in the middle. It is where the story seems to have already finished. But it hadn't. It never really finished at all. Stay with us. You will not regret it. Welcome to Shadows of Stardom, where the gloss gets stripped away and the real person underneath the legend finally gets to speak. Carol Burnett. Say the name and half of America feels something warm stir inside. The Queen of Comedy, a national treasure. The woman who held the country's hand for 50 years and said, "It's going to be all right. Just laugh. I'm right here." She didn't just make people laugh, she healed them. Every Saturday night, millions sat down in front of their televisions, not because they had nothing better to do, but because without her, the evening would have felt wrong, empty. She wasn't a star to them, she was a companion. A person inside the screen you trusted from the very first second. 25 Emmy Awards. 11 seasons of her own show. The Presidential Medal of Freedom. A star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. This isn't a career, it's a monument. This isn't a biography, it's a chapter of American cultural history taught in universities and quoted in academic dissertations. But here is the question nobody dared to ask out loud. Was she happy? Not on stage, not in front of the camera, not in the moment when the studio audience erupted and she took her bow under the lights, but at home, in the silence. When the lights went out, the makeup came off, and there was just a woman left. No role, no script, no audience. Because behind all that brilliance, there was another life running in parallel. The kind that never makes it into press releases. The kind that gets edited out of anniversary specials and tribute reels. A life in which the funniest woman in America faced a level of pain that would have broken most people beyond repair. Alcoholic parents. A poverty-stricken childhood shared with her grandmother in a single room. A daughter she nearly lost to drug addiction, and eventually did lose, though to something far crueler. Legal battles fought in courtrooms. Family tragedies that repeated themselves across generations with the relentless precision of a Greek drama. This is the side of her life that existed for decades alongside her public triumphs, invisible to the millions who adored her, hidden in plain sight behind every laugh she gave them. Today, Carol Burnett is 92 years old. At that age, people either go quiet or they finally tell the truth. She chose the truth, and what she is saying now is not a memoir polished for a pretty book jacket. It is a confession, honest, at times unbearable, at times so intimate it feels almost wrong to hear. She is ready to talk about what it cost to be everyone's anchor while failing to hold on to the people she loved most. She is ready to say out loud what her fans had long suspected but never dared to ask. So who was Carol Burnett, really? A happy woman lucky enough to make people laugh? Or a woman who laughed because crying simply wasn't an option? 92 years old. Most people at that age choose silence. They choose to leave the past undisturbed. They choose to take certain things with them rather than say them out loud. Carol Burnett is not most people, and right now, in her 10th decade, she has decided to speak about things she kept quiet for half a century. This is not about creative secrets, not about Hollywood backstage politics, not about who was sleeping with whom on set. This is about something far more personal and far heavier. About a secret she carried for 50 years. A secret that, in every meaningful sense, shaped the entire course of her life. About a man whose name she has never revealed publicly and who nonetheless stands behind every achievement she ever made. About a promise made with trembling hands by a 20-year-old girl from Hollywood's poorest corners. A promise she kept to the very last letter. And about her daughter, about Carrie. About the part of this story that no award and no amount of success could ever silence or fix. This comes down to 3 defining moments in her biography, 3 turning points without which it is impossible to understand who Carol Burnett really is and why her story matters not just as a celebrity story, but as a human one. Start with the mysterious benefactor. When she was young, truly nobody, a girl with no money, no connections, no visible future, a stranger appeared in her life. He was not a producer. He was not an agent. He simply saw something in her that no one else was looking for, and he did something that changed everything. He gave her money, a significant sum for those times, and he asked for 3 promises in return, 3 conditions she honored her entire life, quietly, without fanfare, without a single press release. Who was this man? She will not say his name even today. Why? You will find out. Now, the oath. 50 years is not a slip of the tongue. For 50 years she kept her silence while journalists dug, fans constructed theories, and tabloids invented their own versions of events. For 50 years she deflected, changed the subject, smiled, and walked away from the question. Because a promise is a promise, even if it was made to a stranger, even if that stranger has long since passed. For Carol Burnett, a vow is not a formality, it is a foundation. And then there is Carrie, her eldest daughter, the one for whom Carol once did something almost unheard of in Hollywood. She walked out to the press and told the truth about her own family. Not for ratings, not for sympathy, to save her child. She succeeded. They reconciled. They managed to build something together. And then time ran out. Not because of anyone's fault, not because of anyone's weakness. It simply ran out. And Carol has been living with that loss ever since. To understand why, at 92, tears come to her eyes at the mention of certain flowers, you need to go back to the very beginning. To Hollywood in the 1940s, to a single room, to a little girl who fell asleep by the light leaking under the door and dreamed of a different life. It was there, in that apartment, in that childhood, in that pain, that the woman the world would call the Queen of Laughter was first formed. Hollywood in the 1940s was a place where dreams were manufactured. Literally a few miles from apartment 102, studio lights blazed, limousines cruised the boulevards, and restaurants were filled with people whose names the whole country knew. Hollywood was a symbol. Hollywood was a promise. If you lived there, you were already closer to the fairy tale than the rest of the world. Carol Burnett lived in that same city. She just didn't get the fairy tale. Apartment 102, one room. A pull-down bed that came out of the wall each evening and took up nearly all the available floor space. No separate corner for a child. No territory to call her own. Just her grandmother, whom Carol called Nanny, and herself. Two people in one room, in the same city as Hollywood, but in an entirely different world. At night, they left the closet door slightly open. Not out of carelessness. The sliver of light from the hallway simply made the darkness a little less suffocating. That was their way of coping. Small, almost absurd, but it was theirs. This belongs to the early 1940s, when Carol was roughly 8 to 10 years old, the period in which her childhood took on the shape that would define everything that followed. Her parents existed. Technically, they were there. Her father, Jody Burnett, was charming, good-looking, with a streak of artistic personality. Her mother, Louise, also had something in her. She wrote, she dreamed, she could be vivid and alive. Both were people in whom something might have flourished. But alcohol had other plans. Not all at once, not in a single day. Gradually, methodically, it pulled them back under each time they tried to surface. Carol watched this from close range. She watched the man who had just been her father turn into someone unrecognizable. She watched her mother, who could laugh and hold her, disappear so far inside herself that there was no reaching her anymore. A child in that kind of household learns quickly how to read the atmosphere, learns to understand from the way someone walks, from a glance, from the sound of a slamming door, what is about to happen. Carol learned, and she found a tool that worked better than tears and better than shouting. She started making people laugh. Faces, voices, ridiculous stories, anything that could shift the mood, dissolve the tension, make someone in the room smile for even a second. Humor was not a talent. Humor was a survival strategy, a way of saying, everything is under control, nothing terrible is happening, look at me, I'm funny. The one truly reliable person in all of this chaos was Nanny. A grandmother without higher education, without money, without connections, but with an iron will and an absolute devotion to this child. She was the one who took Carol to the cinema. Not because they had spare money for entertainment, there was barely enough for food, but the movies were a cheap ticket into another reality. There, in the darkness of the theater, on the big screen, families existed where everything turned out fine, where the father didn't drink, where the mother didn't vanish, where children were protected. Carol watched that screen and memorized what she saw. Not as a viewer, as someone who was going to get there herself one day. It was in those cinema halls, in that apartment with the closet door left open, beside a grandmother who was simultaneously mother, father, and best friend. It was there that the character was formed that would later carry 11 seasons of live television on its shoulders. Not because of a happy childhood, in spite of an unhappy one. There are moments that split a life into before and after. Not loud moments, quiet ones. Not the kind that end up on the first page of biographies, but the ones that happen almost by accident, almost invisibly, and only years later do you understand. That was it. That was the point where everything changed. For Carol Burnett, that point was an envelope. She was in her early 20s. Behind her, apartment 102. Nanny, 2 alcoholic parents, and a childhood that had toughened her in ways no acting school ever could. She was already performing, at small venues, private parties, the kind of places that paid little or nothing at all. She had been accepted to UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, one of the finest universities in the country. But the cost of tuition was about as realistic for her as a trip to the moon. There was no money. None. Not a single dollar to spare. This belongs to the early 1950s, the moment when the encounter took place that Carol would not discuss publicly for 50 years. At one of those private performances, a man approached her. Not an agent, not a producer, not anyone from the industry. Just a businessman. He had been watching her, carefully, without the showy enthusiasm of someone trying to impress. At a certain point, he pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was $1,000. In today's terms, roughly $10,000. In the terms of that girl from the one-room apartment, it was another life entirely. But with the envelope came 3 conditions. Not requests, conditions. Firm and simple. First, never, under any circumstances, reveal his name. Not to journalists, not to friends, not in any memoir. His name stays with him, permanently. Second, spend the money on her dream. Not on food, not on rent, not on sorting out debts. On the dream. On the thing that made her get on stage in the first place. Third, if she succeeded, and he was certain she would, she must do the same for someone else. Help the way she had been helped. Without publicity, without any expectation of repayment. Simply pass it forward. Carol took the envelope with trembling hands. She said she agreed, and she did not lie. With that money, she boarded a train to New York City. Not a plane, a train, because the train was cheaper and every spare dollar needed to be preserved. America rolled past the window, endless, indifferent, vast, and she sat there thinking, probably, that something impossible was happening. That the girl from apartment 102, the daughter of 2 alcoholics, was on her way to New York to build a career. It sounded like a bad screenplay, too implausible even for Hollywood. And yet, that is exactly how it happened. She never once revealed the benefactor's name. Not in any interview, not in any book, not in any public appearance across more than 50 years. Journalists tried, fans constructed theories, tabloids threw out names. She stayed silent. Not because she had forgotten, not because it no longer mattered, but because a promise is a promise. And that, perhaps, tells you more about her than any award sitting on her shelf. The third condition she also honored. Quietly, without press conferences. Throughout her entire career, she helped young performers, with money, with connections, with her time. She never made a spectacle of it, because that was the agreement, because that is how real gratitude works, not publicly, but in substance. $1,000, 3 promises, 1 train to New York City. That is exactly what the first step toward one of the most brilliant careers in American television history cost. New York in the 1950s did not forgive weakness. The city had a talent for spotting outsiders on arrival and grinding them down so efficiently that they barely understood what had happened. Thousands of young people arrived every year with dreams and envelopes of last resort money. Most went home within a year or two, quietly, without explanation, with expressions on their faces that explained everything anyway. Carol Burnett did not go home. She was not a conventional beauty, and that matters. Hollywood at the time knew exactly what it wanted. Blonde hair, sculpted features, a languid gaze, minimal personality, and maximum compliance. Carol was something else entirely. A wide mouth, long arms, a face capable of portraying 20 different people in the space of a single second. From society hostess to village idiot. By the standards of her era, she was not pretty. And that is precisely what made her extraordinary. She conquered Broadway with the musical Once Upon a Mattress in 1959. The role of Princess Winifred, clumsy, booming, utterly incompatible with the image of a delicate heroine, brought her the first genuine wave of recognition. Critics wrote about her with a mixture of enthusiasm and bafflement, as though they hadn't expected something so far outside the standard to be so completely brilliant. Audiences simply laughed until they cried and kept coming back for more tickets. This belongs to the late 1950s and early 60s, when Carol was already well known in New York's theatrical and television circles, but still a few years away from her greatest triumph. Television noticed her quickly. She appeared on various programs, made guest appearances, performed on CBS on The Gary Moore Show, and every single time she left behind a feeling that this particular person needed to be seen far more, much more. The network sensed it. Audiences sensed it. Everyone sensed it, except the people making the decisions. In 1967, Carol Burnett walked into CBS with a proposal. She wanted her own variety show, weekly, in prime time, with sketches, guest stars, music, and complete creative freedom. The response was predictable and condescending in equal measure. Network executives explained to her patiently, the way one explains something obvious to someone who simply cannot grasp a straightforward point. Variety is a male format. It always had been. Sid Caesar, a man. Jackie Gleason, a man. Milton Berle, a man. A woman hosting a prime-time variety show was nonsense. It would not work. It was a failure before it started. They offered her a sitcom instead. The funny wife, that was her place, her ceiling, what was expected of her. Carol Burnett said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply no. She had a contract with CBS that included an option for her own show, and she intended to use it. Lawyers dealt with the paperwork. Negotiations were difficult. The network pushed back, but the language of the contract was on her side, and eventually the Carol Burnett Show received the green light. The premiere aired on September 11, 1967. Nobody expected much. Critics adopted a wait-and-see position. Competitors, by some accounts, were laughing, but not with her. At her. A woman with a prime-time variety show. Fine, let's see how long this lasts. It lasted 11 seasons. 11 years, every Saturday evening, America sat down in front of the television, and Carol was there. With her ensemble, Harvey Korman, Tim Conway, Vicki Lawrence, Lyle Waggoner. The chemistry between them was so genuine that cast members regularly broke into real laughter in the middle of sketches. Not scripted, not performed, but because holding it together was simply impossible. Audiences loved those moments even more than the rehearsed material, because they were real. One sketch became iconic for decades. A parody of Gone with the Wind, Carol descends a staircase in a magnificent gown, sewn together from curtains, complete with the curtain rod still jutting from the shoulders. The image spread across the country instantly. It was not merely a joke, it was a statement. A statement that you could laugh at grandeur, at pomposity, at the very idea of Hollywood glamour, and do it with such precision and affection that the original only gained from the comparison. 25 Emmy Awards. That is not a misprint and not an exaggeration. 25. The show collected awards with such regularity that it stopped being surprising and simply became the norm. Golden Globes, a Peabody Award. Critical recognition, recognition from peers, recognition from audiences, all simultaneously, all deserved. They told her, "This is not for women. She did it better than any man before her." Or since. In 1976, Carol Burnett was at the top. The show was in its 9th season, ratings held firm. Her name was known across the entire country. What could possibly go wrong? The answer came from the National Enquirer. For those unfamiliar with the publication, the National Enquirer in the 1970s was not simply a tabloid. It was a scandal manufacturing machine, powerful, ruthless, and entirely without accountability. Its circulation ran into the millions. Racks of the paper stood beside every checkout in every supermarket across the country. People picked it up automatically, on the way out, somewhere between the bread and the milk. The editors knew this and exploited it without the faintest trace of remorse. Truth interested them only to the extent that it could be sold. If it couldn't, they substituted something else. That year, they ran a piece about Carol Burnett. She had allegedly been spotted in a Washington restaurant, drunk, loud, and arguing disruptively with Henry Kissinger. The details were vivid and specific, precisely the kind of details that make a lie convincing. The restaurant was named. The behavior was described. The tone was one of reluctant disclosure, as though the editors were regretfully sharing an unpleasant truth about someone the public had always adored. This comes down to a fundamental distinction between how that story would have landed on any other celebrity and how it landed on Carol Burnett. For another star, it might have been an inconvenience, irritating but manageable. Hollywood had seen worse scandals. People went quiet, waited for the noise to die down, and moved on. Her lawyers advised exactly that. Don't respond. Any reaction only feeds the interest. The tabloid wants attention. Deny it attention. You'll survive this. But for Carol, this story was not about her reputation. It was about something else entirely. Deeper, more personal, more painful. She had grown up alongside alcoholism. She had watched what it did to people. To intelligent, talented, vivid people who started with a glass of wine and ended by ceasing to be themselves. Her father, her mother, both bright, both broken, both having lost everything they had to that dependency. Carol had made herself a promise in her youth. Never. Not because she considered herself superior, because she knew she had every chance of becoming them. Genetics, environment, circumstance, everything was stacked against her. She chose sobriety consciously, as an act of self-preservation, as a daily exercise of will. And now a newspaper with a circulation of millions was telling the country that she got drunk and made scenes in restaurants. This was not defamation of a celebrity. It was a violation of the most personal, most painful decision of her life. It was an assault on what she had protected since childhood: her sobriety, her discipline, her determination not to become the parents she had loved and been unable to save. Her lawyers said, "Don't engage." Her friends said, "Let it go." Her colleagues said, "It isn't worth your time." Taking a tabloid to court meant spending years, energy, and money for a moral satisfaction that wasn't even guaranteed. Tabloids knew how to defend themselves. They had experienced lawyers. They had done this many times before. They knew how to walk away clean. Carol Burnett filed the lawsuit anyway. Not for the money, she had plenty. Not for the publicity, she had more than enough of that already. She filed because there are things that cannot be left unanswered. Because silence in the face of a lie is not wisdom, it is surrender. Because her reputation was not for sale, not for the price of a cheap headline, not for anyone's convenience. The case was long. The National Enquirer defended itself aggressively, the way organizations defend themselves when they are accustomed to winning through resources rather than through truth. They challenged details, disputed the timeline, prolonged proceedings. But the facts were on Carol's side. Witnesses contradicted the tabloid's account. There was no evidence that the described scene had taken place because it hadn't. The jury ruled in Carol Burnett's favor. The original award was $1.6 million in damages. The figure was later adjusted on appeal, but the victory itself remained intact. She had won, alone, against a publication that had previously appeared untouchable. A woman with principles, against a system built on their absence. The case set a legal precedent. After it, other public figures began to feel they could take tabloids to court, knowing it was possible, knowing it was not necessarily a losing battle. Carol Burnett changed the rules. Not deliberately, simply because she could not stay silent. There are things you cannot prevent even when you know everything about them, even when you have seen them with your own eyes, even when you have spent your entire life building a wall between your children and the darkness that destroyed your own family. Carol knew about alcoholism and addiction more intimately than most addiction specialists. Not from books, but from lived experience. She had watched how it begins, how it progresses, how it ends. And still, it came into her home. Only this time, not through her parents, through her daughter. Carrie Hamilton was the eldest of Carol's 3 children. Bright, talented, with an artistic streak, her mother's daughter in every sense. She grew up in comfort, in love, in a household where there was no alcohol and where her mother had done everything possible to create the family she herself had never had. Everything done correctly, every lesson learned, every precaution taken. But addiction does not ask whether you deserve it. It does not punish mistakes or spare people who made the right choices. It simply arrives and takes. In her teenage years, Carrie began using drugs. Exactly how it started, at precisely which turn, that is not the point. What matters is that Carol saw it early enough to still have room to act. And the way she acted set her apart from her own parents in the most fundamental way imaginable. This belongs to the mid-1980s, a period when the show had already ended. Carol's reputation was at its peak, and at the very same time, a crisis was unfolding in her personal life that Hollywood preferred not to acknowledge. Her parents, in their time, had chosen silence, closed doors, the appearance that everything was fine. A shame that was never named out loud, because if you didn't name it, it was somehow less real. Carol knew where that strategy led. She had seen the ending twice, in two different people she had loved. Silence does not treat addiction. Silence feeds it. So she did something that very few people in Hollywood in the 1980s were willing to do. She spoke. Not quietly, in private, publicly. She gave interviews, appeared on magazine covers, not to promote a new project, but to say plainly, "My family is in crisis. My daughter is addicted. I am fighting. We are fighting. This is happening to us right now." For a star of her standing, this was the equivalent of walking onto a stage without costume or makeup. Completely exposed, completely open, with no possibility of walking it back. At the same time, she applied what psychologists call tough love. No safety nets. No shielding Carrie from consequences. No money that could be used to continue the self-destruction. Carol held boundaries, painful, hard boundaries that broke her heart to maintain. She refused to do what most parents do out of fear and love combined. Pretend everything is manageable, and in doing so, allow the chaos to continue. It was agonizing. There is no other word. To watch your child destroying herself and not rush to rescue her by the familiar means, that requires a strength of will that most people simply do not possess. Carol possessed it, because she knew there was no other path. She had already seen what happens when the people who love you look away. Carrie went through rehabilitation, not on the first attempt. Addiction rarely releases its hold at the first try. But she got through it. She came out the other side. She became sober and stayed sober. And at a certain point, something happened between mother and daughter that in stories like this rarely occurs. Not simply reconciliation, but genuine closeness. They became friends, not just mother and daughter, two people who had walked through a shared hell and come out together on the other side. They wrote a play, Hollywood Arms, based on Carol's memoir, on that very apartment 102, on Nanny, on a childhood that could have been a source of bitterness, but which they chose instead to transform into art. The play reached Broadway, mother and daughter together, on the other side of the pain that had nearly separated them forever. It felt like the ending of a story, a happy ending, earned and honest. Life had different plans. Sometimes life gives a person just enough happiness to make the next blow as unbearable as possible. Carrie was sober. Carrie was alive, genuinely alive, not the kind of life that flickers at the bottom of addiction, but full, conscious, her own. She was working, she was creating, she was present with her mother, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person whose company was wanted. The play was running on Broadway. They had just made something real together. It felt like arrival, like the place you reach after everything that came before it. In 2001, Carrie Hamilton was given a diagnosis, lung cancer, with metastases to the brain. 37 years old, sober, full of plans. There is no logic that can contain this, and there shouldn't be, because there is no logic here. There is only a fact, bare and irreversible. A woman who had just defeated one illness found herself face to face with another. And this second one had no intention of retreating. This is one of the cruelest paradoxes in Carol Burnett's biography. At the precise moment she finally allowed herself to breathe, life delivered a blow against which no strategy exists, no willpower, no tough love. Against this, there is nothing. Carol was present, not in the way that stars are present for loved ones, from a distance, through assistance and arranged care. She was physically there. She sat by her daughter's bedside. She held her hand. She watched the woman she had brought into the world, had nearly lost once and pulled back. She watched her go, slowly, day by day, toward the place from which no one returns. The hardest part of a situation like this is not the fact of the inevitable itself. The hardest part is knowing there is nothing to be done. Carol knew how to fight, how to push, insist, litigate, walk onto a stage with a shattered heart and perform so that no one in the audience suspected a thing. But here there was no opponent to serve with legal papers, no tabloid to answer, no script that could be rewritten. There was only a hospital corridor and a daughter behind a closed door. In January 2002, shortly before the end, Carrie said something to her mother. Quietly, the way people speak when they know time is short and every word must count. She said she would not disappear completely, that she would find a way to send a sign, that Carol would know she was all right. "I'll find a way to let you know," she said. "I'll send you a sign. You'll know it's me." Carrie Hamilton passed away on January 20th, 2002. She was 38 years old. The curtain came down. There was no applause. Carol spoke later about the months that followed as a kind of existence that was difficult to call living. Not because she had broken. She did not know how to break completely. It was not in her nature. But the world around her had become different, less real, less significant. The awards on her shelf looked back at her like objects from another person's life. Laughter, the very laughter she had been able to produce professionally, on command, began to feel like a language she had once spoken fluently but could no longer quite recall. And then it happened. Several months later, Carol was sitting in a restaurant, alone. A wave of grief came over her at the table. Suddenly, the way it does when you believe you are holding yourself together and then discover, without warning, that you are not, that the pain has not gone anywhere. It was simply waiting for a moment of stillness. A stranger approached her table. Not a fan asking for an autograph, just a person. Without saying a single word, they placed a bouquet of flowers in front of her and walked away. Birds of paradise. Carrie's absolute favorite flowers, the ones her daughter had adored her entire life, the ones Carol knew intimately, and the ones this stranger could not possibly have known anything about. Carol Burnett, the woman who had survived poverty, her parents' alcoholism, public humiliation, and years of struggle, wept at that table. Not from grief, from something else. From a feeling that could not be explained rationally, but was entirely, unmistakably real. She had received her sign. Her daughter had kept her promise. 80 years had passed since a little girl fell asleep in apartment 102, watching the sliver of light beneath the closet door. 80 years, and life, having traced an enormous arc through Broadway, CBS, courtrooms and hospital corridors, brought Carol Burnett back to the same point. Only now she was not the girl who needed protection. She was the grandmother who had to provide it. History knows how to repeat itself, especially the parts you least want repeated. Carol's youngest daughter, Erin, had fallen into the grip of the same dependency that had once taken Carol's parents and nearly taken Carrie. The precise circumstances, the details, the timeline. Carol kept all of it away from the press as much as she could, protecting her daughter to the last possible degree. But the central fact could not be concealed. The situation had spiraled beyond control, and at the center of the chaos was a child. Carol's grandson, Dylan, a boy who had not chosen the circumstances of his birth, just as a little girl in apartment 102 had not chosen hers. This belongs to 2020, the year Carol Burnett was approaching 90, the year the entire world shut down, and the year when she, instead of the retirement she had fully earned, found herself facing one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She filed for legal guardianship of her grandson. Consider that for a moment. A woman approaching 90. A woman who had survived more than most people encounter across several lifetimes. A woman who had every justification to say, "I have done everything I could. This is no longer my battle." Instead, she gathered her documents and went to court, not for headlines, not for public sympathy, for a boy who was in danger of being swallowed by the same chaos she understood from the inside better than anyone. A courtroom is not where you expect to encounter a Hollywood legend. It is where people sit during the hardest moments of their lives. Carol Burnett sat among them, without glamour, without an entourage, frail, small, at an age when most people have long since delegated their battles to others, and yet absolutely, in every fiber, unshakable. She looked at the judge and said what she had come to say. "This child will not fall through the cracks. I will not allow it." In that moment, there was no queen of comedy, no icon of American television, no woman with 25 Emmy Awards on her shelf. There was a grandmother, the same one from apartment 102, only now on the other side of the story. Nanny had once refused to let the world swallow Carol. Not because she had money or influence, she had neither. Simply because she had decided it would not happen and placed herself between the child and the void. Now Carol was doing the same. The circle had closed, precisely without sentiment, without any softening of its edges. The court granted her petition. Carol was awarded guardianship of Dylan. There was no press conference, no glossy magazine interview, no triumphant statement about winning. Because this was not a victory in the sense that victories are usually celebrated. It was simply work. Hard, necessary, the only possible work of a person who does not know how to look away when someone nearby is in trouble. People who knew Carol well said they had never seen her so tired and never so focused. The exhaustion came from the weight she was carrying. The focus came from knowing exactly why she was carrying it. These are different things, and it was precisely that difference that kept her upright. There is a kind of person who becomes stronger not despite their losses, but through them. Not because pain makes them numb, but because it makes them precise. They stop spending energy on what does not matter. They see what is essential where others see only circumstance. Carol Burnett is exactly that kind of person. At 90 years old, she was not asking life for rest. She was asking it for one more chance to do correctly what had once been done for her. In another generation, in another apartment, in another century, by her grandmother. Simply to be present, simply not to step aside, simply to stay. This is not heroism in the sense that screens usually show it. It is quieter than that. It has no applause. It is precisely the kind of thing that actually holds the world together. When someone else's story ends, a conversation about our own begins. Because everything we have talked about today is not only about Carol Burnett. It is about a mechanism that operates inside every family. about a cycle that passes from generation to generation, not through malice, but simply because pain that has not been lived through does not disappear. It waits. It finds the next person close enough to reach, and strikes again. Ask yourself honestly, is there something in your life that you do not speak about? Not because it is unimportant, but precisely because it is too important. Is there someone you can smile about in conversation with strangers, but cannot think of alone without pain? Is there a role you perform every day, the strong one, the one who copes, the one who holds everything together, and that costs you far more than anyone around you suspects? If yes, you understand Carol Burnett better than any biographer ever could. There is a comfortable assumption that the people who laugh the loudest are the happiest. It is comfortable because it removes the need to look more carefully. If someone is laughing, they must be fine. No need to ask, no need to worry, move on. Carol Burnett spent 50 years giving people exactly that feeling, and that is precisely why almost no one thought to ask what was happening off camera. She was too good at her job. This is about how we look at the people around us, and how often what we see is not what is actually there. Life does not ask whether you are ready. It does not choose a convenient moment. It makes no allowance for the fact that you have already been through enough, that you are exhausted, that you had only just begun to breathe again. Carol's parents drank. She did not choose that. Her daughter became ill. She did not choose that. Her grandson was in danger. She did not choose that. The only thing she chose each time was what to do next. And each time she chose the same thing: not to look away, not to stay silent, not to wait and see if it resolved itself. To act. That sounds simple. It is not simple, because to act means admitting the problem exists, and admitting it means becoming vulnerable. And becoming vulnerable in a world that respects only strength, that requires a courage that fits inside no version of any public image. Carol Burnett walked out to the press and said, "My daughter is addicted." She went to court and said, "I have been defamed and I will not stay quiet." She walked into a courtroom at 90 and said, "This child is under my protection." Each time, it was an act of naked vulnerability. And each time, that was precisely what gave her the strength to do it. We live in a culture that sells us the image of imperviousness. A successful person does not cry. A strong woman manages on her own. A good parent keeps the family in order. All of this is a comfortable lie we tell each other to avoid feeling alone in our weakness. And then we feel even more alone, because everyone around us apparently has everything under control, while we do not. Carol Burnett dismantled that lie, not through declarations or manifestos, simply through the way she lived. She showed that it is possible to be funny and broken at the same time, famous and lonely at the same time, strong and in need of help at the same time, that these things do not contradict each other, that a person is not one fixed state, but a constant movement between many. To laugh through pain is not performance, it is not weakness, and it is not cowardice. It is the choice to keep living while life continues. It is the refusal to allow circumstances to write the ending of a story before the story is over. Carol laughed and simultaneously fought legal battles. Carol laughed and simultaneously sat at the bedside of her dying daughter. Carol laughed and simultaneously walked into court for her grandson. The laughter was not a mask. The laughter was a tool, a way of staying alive and staying herself at the same time. Think of the person in your life who is always fine, who always smiles, who never complains and never asks for anything. Ask them how they actually are. Not how are things, but how they really are. Sometimes that question changes everything. Sometimes a person simply needs to know that someone noticed, that someone is looking a little more carefully than usual. Carol Burnett touched her earlobe at the end of every single program for decades. Millions of people saw that gesture. Nobody knew what it meant. And what it meant was, I am here. I remember. I love you. 3 things that all of us want to hear, and so rarely say to each other out loud. We began with a gesture. Let us end with one. Every time Carol Burnett touched her earlobe at the end of a program, she was doing something very simple and at the same time very rare. She was telling another person, "You are not alone. I see you. I remember you." Amid all the noise, the lights, the cameras, the millions of strangers watching, I am thinking of you. Her grandmother Nanny received that signal every Saturday. She would sit down in front of the television, look at the screen, and know that the granddaughter she had raised in a one-room apartment with a pull-down bed, whom she had taken to the cinema instead of dinner, for whom she had left the closet door ajar so the darkness would not press so heavily, that granddaughter had not forgotten, had made something of herself, had become famous across the whole country, and still had not forgotten. Every Saturday, until the very end. Nanny passed away in 1967, the same year the first episode of The Carol Burnett Show aired. She lived long enough to see what became of that girl, long enough to receive her signal. After that, Carol continued touching her ear for another 11 years, no longer for her grandmother, for the memory of her. To keep unbroken the thread that connected her to apartment 102, to the one person who had been there when no one else was. This is not simply a touching detail from a celebrity's biography. It is a reminder that the most important connections in our lives are not the ones that get written up in gossip columns, not the ones photographed on red carpets. They are the ones that hold us when everything else falls apart. A grandmother in a small apartment, a daughter holding a hand, a stranger with a bouquet of flowers who had no idea they were performing a miracle. If Carol Burnett's story did something to you today, if somewhere in the middle of it you thought of a specific person, or remembered something of your own, or felt something that took a moment to find a name for, then it did what it was told for. Then it reached you. Share this video. Not because an algorithm requires the reach, and not because we are asking for support, but because among the people you know, there may be someone who needs exactly this right now. Someone who laughs the loudest and is holding on by their last thread. Someone who plays the role of the strong one and has not heard in a long time that they are allowed to be something less. Someone who has lost someone and does not know whether they are still permitted to grieve or whether they are supposed to have moved on by now. People like that do not need advice. They need to know they are not alone, that someone who went through something similar survived. And not just survived, remained themselves. Carol Burnett remains herself at 92, with the grandson she took under her protection, with the memory of the daughter she could not keep, with gratitude for the grandmother who kept her, with a story she finally decided to tell all the way to the end. Not for her own sake, but because stories like this need to be told. Because darkness does not disappear when you stay silent about it, but when someone leaves a sliver of light, it becomes a little easier to bear. Nanny left the closet door ajar. Carol touched her earlobe. Each of us does this in our own way, tells the person we love, "I am here. I remember. I have not gone." If this story moved you, hit the like button. It takes a second and it tells us, you were here, you listened, it mattered to you. Subscribe to the channel. This is exactly the kind of story we tell. Not about the glitter and the red carpets, but about the real people standing behind them. And ring the notification bell so the next story finds you first. Thank you for staying until the end. That is a gesture in itself. Carol Burnett would have appreciated it.